The reading today is taken from Mark 10:32 to 52. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later he will rise again."
Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink, and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared." When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, "You know what those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many."
Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called the blind man. "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked this question twice in our Bible reading this morning, once to 2 of his disciples, to James and John, and once to a beggar, a blind man named Bartimaeus. And Jesus gets 2 very different responses. So let's look together at Mark chapter 10, verses 32 to 52, and find out what's going on. And I'd encourage you to look up Mark 10 in a Bible, or get it up on your phone or a tablet, and follow along as we go through. This is a passage about seeing Jesus for who he really is, and what this means for the disciples and for the readers of Mark's Gospel, and that includes us. Now, the passage we have this morning is not the beginning of Jesus' teaching his disciples about his role and theirs. It's the final part of nearly 2 chapters in Mark's Gospel where Jesus has been teaching his disciples. Jesus' teaching of his disciples begins in chapter 8 with the miracle of sight, and ends here in chapter 10 with the miracle of sight. Yet here in chapter 10, even after 2 chapters of teaching, Jesus' disciples still do not see. They still don't understand Jesus' role, his purpose, what's about to happen in Jerusalem, why it matters so much, and how Jesus changes everything. This is the third time in verses 32, 33, and 34 that Jesus tells his disciples about his death. And it's graphic. The other two times you can find them in Mark chapter 8, 31 and Mark chapter 9, 31. The other two times have not contained the detail that we have here in Mark 10. Jesus' death is to take place in Jerusalem, where he will be mocked, spat upon, flogged, and killed. Jesus spells out what is about to happen next. But the disciples still don't understand. Jesus is, verse 32, leading the way to Jerusalem, where he knows he will die. The disciples are astonished and afraid. Why would Jesus be travelling with a sense of urgency to a place where Jesus is telling them horrific things will happen to him? But it's more complicated than the disciples just not getting it, not being able to make sense of what Jesus is saying. Because at least two of them, James and John, seem to think they do understand. And I guess it's maybe a bit like the difference between coming out of an exam and knowing you've probably not done too well because you didn't answer half the questions, you left them blank, versus coming out of the exam having confidently answered every single question and then getting the results back and discovering answers that you thought were right were actually wrong. I think that's the kind of difference here. So James and John are coming confidently out of their exam thinking they've got all the answers right. So it's not just that James and John don't understand, it's that they think they understand when they don't understand. Apparently ignoring the graphic details of what Jesus has said is about to happen in Jerusalem. They don't seem to care about those. They go to Jesus and make this rather forthright statement. We want you to do for us whatever we ask. And what is it that they want Jesus to do for them? They want seats next to Jesus in glory. Jesus is about to die a horrific death, and James and John are asking about the best seats in glory. There's a big disconnect going on here. The future Jesus foresees is very different from what James and John think is going to happen. One version of events is characterized by humility, the other by arrogance. And Jesus tells them this: you don't know what you are asking. And he speaks of a cup and a baptism. In the Old Testament, cup is a metaphor for judgment and suffering, and baptism a metaphor for being overwhelmed. Drinking someone's cup is an expression for sharing their fate. Jesus is talking about judgment and suffering and being completely overwhelmed. James and John clearly don't get what's been asked of them because they confidently respond, we can. And the reality is James and John simply cannot do what Jesus must do in Jerusalem. It's a task that only the Son of God can fulfill. And whilst there will be some ways in which they will share in the suffering of Jesus, being a follower of Jesus, as we're about to be reminded, is costly, this doesn't get them seats next to Jesus in glory. Now, our instinct might be to criticize or to judge James and John for their lack of insight and their selfish ambition. But I'd like to suggest that in many ways their response is very human. Their expectation is that the promised Jewish Messiah will be a strong, powerful ruler who will liberate God's people from oppressive Roman rule. They are not expecting the Messiah to be a suffering servant king. James and John, along with Peter, are Jesus' inner circle. And so if they're thinking in these kind of military terms, it's sort of logical that they're assuming they'll have a special status. If the Messiah's a powerful ruler, he's going to want powerful chiefs underneath him. How many of us have ever not fully understood something? How many of us have ever not fully understood something and yet been confident that we're right? We know what's happening. We know where we're going. We're going in the right direction. We know what we're doing, whatever it may be. How many of us have ever pursued recognition or status? What the disciples don't yet seem to be able to see is that Jesus is a very different Messiah. He will bring a freedom far greater than the disciples are imagining, and in the most unexpected of ways. Glory through suffering. Victory through defeat. And his disciples are called to follow his radical example. It's just taken them a while to work all of this out. The way of Jesus is not one of rulers lording it over people or high officials exercising authority. That's verse 42. It's about service. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. Verse 43. This is the complete opposite of what the disciples would have expected. It doesn't make sense to them. It's so outside of their experience. We need to remember that we as readers, we know what's about to happen in Jerusalem, but James and John didn't. This is really new, really unexpected, and really radical. Jesus came to bring freedom from sin, and for this to happen, a price needed to be paid. Jesus gave his life to serve others. Jesus gave his life to serve us. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is new. This is unexpected. This is radical. If the disciples had written a job description for what they were hoping for and expected from the Messiah, Jesus has come along and completely rewritten it. He's not just made a few tweaks, he's torn it up and rewritten it. And because the disciples have misunderstood Jesus' role, they've misunderstood their own role. They've got the wrong idea of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, because they've not understood Jesus' death and its significance. They need to see Jesus for who he really is, Messiah and Saviour. So what does a model disciple of Jesus look like? Well, the disciples' response to the question, "What do you want me to do for you?" is in stark contrast to that of Bartimaeus, a blind man who is begging at the roadside. Hearing that Jesus is in town, Bartimaeus twice cries out to Jesus to have mercy on him, verses 47 and 48. Jesus calls Bartimaeus to come to him, and such is Bartimaeus' faith that Jesus will change his life, and his courage to allow Jesus to change his circumstances. It would have been a massive deal for Bartimaeus to go from having spent his life begging at the roadside to having to work for a living. He's going from being blind to seeing. But such is Bartimaeus' courage to allow Jesus to change his life, that he throws his cloak aside, he jumps to his feet, and he's there with Jesus. Bartimaeus recognizes who Jesus is. He recognizes his need of him. He can see that Jesus is changing things up, and he wants in. He lays aside everything to go to Jesus when he calls, and he responds to receiving his sight by following Jesus. So what does all this mean for us? I've got a few thoughts. I think I got 5 of them. I can't remember. So number 1, perhaps Jesus, the greatest servant who gave his life for us, is not the Jesus you know. Perhaps that's not how you imagine Jesus. Perhaps that's not how you think of Jesus. If you'd like to know more about who Jesus is and the difference he makes to our lives, we would love to help you to do that. Please do get in touch with us and discover Jesus, the greatest servant, for yourself. Perhaps you need to take heart from hearing how wrong the first disciples got things. They were chosen by Jesus himself, and yet so often they don't understand or they misunderstand. They were selfish at times, they were arrogant at times, they didn't always listen to what Jesus was saying. Remember, he's telling them about his death for the 3rd time in our reading this morning. They didn't always get on with each other. The other 10 were indignant when James and John put themselves forward for special treatment, we heard in our reading today. This is what the first disciples were like. You don't have to be perfect to be a follower of Jesus. You just have to be prepared to go on the journey. Perhaps that's what you need to hear this morning. Perhaps you need the reminder that leadership, having a particular position in life or in the church, doesn't get you the best seats in glory. First calling as Christians is to be disciples of Jesus Christ, followers of Jesus. And that means to serve. That will look different for all of us. But what's true for all of us is that Jesus' way is radical. There's not a reward system where amount or type of service elevates anyone above anyone else. It's not service in, rewards out. It doesn't work like that. Perhaps that's what you need to hear this morning. Leadership or a particular position doesn't get you the best seat in glory. Jesus has a better way, a radical way. Perhaps we need to be challenged by the story of Bartimaeus and ask God to show us our prejudices. No one in this passage fully understands who Jesus is and what's about to happen next in the story. But it's Bartimaeus, the man who physically cannot see, who's by the roadside begging, who sees most clearly. Do we sometimes assume that we see more clearly than others, when perhaps they might see more clearly than us? Perhaps the person we least expect has the insight about following Jesus is the person we most need to hear from. Before I finish, I wonder if I might invite us just to pause for a moment and to ask God what he wants us to see this morning. If Jesus asked you the question, what do you want me to do for you? How would you respond? What is it you might want Jesus to do for you today? Amen.